The Dawdlers' philosophy.
Snippet.
Just a taste.
So, more. Philosophers at a certain time, I don't know if it's so much popular right now, they were often very concerned, perhaps unduly, with attempting to refute what they consider to be crazy ideas or ideas that they don't like. A lot of people have attempted to refute Bishop Berkeley and idealism, or Pyrrho and Sextus and the skeptics. Those are radical epistemologies, and I guess in Berkeley's case, metaphysicses, stimulants for a bunch of ink spilling. And that's what Moore was up to in Proof of an External World. He starts out by quoting Kant, who wrote,
It still remains a scandal to philosophy that the existence of things outside of us must be accepted merely on faith, and that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof.
Kant had his own version of attempting to provide that proof. Moore was not satisfied with Kant's version, and Moore wanted to provide his own. He wants to prove that there are existing things outside of us. And that's what Proof of an External World is about. Moore is asking what sort of proof, if any, can be given of the existence of things outside of us. The first more than half the paper is all just working out what the hell that is supposed to mean, things outside of us. He reformulates it into defining a thing as
whatever can be met with in space,
and wants us to understand it in that very wide sense. Subsequently, people haven't spent much time working on that aspect of it. I think that we think it's relatively clear what we mean by external objects. So people mostly concentrate on his quote-unquote proof, his argument that is supposed to show that, and it's pretty famous. You might have even heard of it as a scientist.
Oh boy. I can't wait.
It seems to me that there is only one possible proof of the existence of things outside of us, which is a perfectly rigorous proof. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain...
Oh, you lost the audience already, Moore. They're laughing you off the stage. How? How can I prove this?
By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. And if by doing this I have proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you will all see that I can do it now in a number of other ways. There's no need to multiply examples. It is perhaps impossible to give a better or more rigorous proof of anything whatever.
Okay, is he trying to say that does it, or is he trying to say that's as good as we can do it? Because if it was interpreted that does it, then yeah, there's some problems there, because it's more surprising that somebody in a learned institution or whatever, like Cambridge or, would be willing to go that low. But then it would be a great bit of comedy, of intellectual comedy at least, to be like, yeah, that's it, folks. Like, I can go around just pointing at things, and that's as good as it gets. I don't know. I'm guessing it's the former, not the latter, but I because of the memorableness of this paper, that probably,
Right. I have the same incredulity about, wait, what? Are you serious? That's your argument? So just to check, I'm pretty sure it is. I've encountered it in multiple venues. To check on this, I went to one of my favorite reference books entitled Just the Arguments by Michael Bruce and Stephen Barbone, which has, I think they collected about 100 famous arguments from philosophy, and then they're the editors, and they get an expert on Moore to come in and write about what his argument is. Their version of the argument is,
Premise 1.
here is a hand, here is another.
Premise 2.
If hands exist, then external objects exist.
Conclusion.
external objects exist by modus ponens from P1 and 2. So indeed, that is, apparently, the argument. So you seem to share with me the prima facie difficulty and resistance buying that argument. What is your problem with it?
I guess it just seems to me like he's just totally accepting that his perception is totally accurate or whatever. And in addition to that, he's using the medium of language in order to say that something is external. I think there's a lot of, like internal referencing, right, with language. So it just seems to me like, to be blunt, it seems like something like one of my kids would say, or, something, really simple. But I guess, philosophy is littered with that, right? I think, therefore, I am, there's a lot of this kind of stuff in philosophy, right? Where they just are like, fuck it. I'm just going to say what I actually think. And then that like makes it into the annals of history and philosophy or whatever.
Yeah. And I don't know. Do you think that simplicity is a critique or a refutation? I don't know. It doesn't bother me how apparently simplistic it is. And then you mentioned that he's doing it with language, but I think that he thinks he's doing almost the opposite. He's demonstrating. He's showing. This isn't just about language. He's ostensibly waving the hand, quote unquote, in front of you as he does the language. Correct.
That's true. Well, I guess the other thing then to me seems like he doesn't take the question very seriously. At the time, maybe that was as good as it could get, and that was good enough or whatever. I like simple models, but I'm skeptical that the simple model is, the best way to go, or that if things are complex, then I think it's likely a simple model. It could be an approximation, or it could just be way off, and due to its simplicity, because it doesn't have enough parameters, and it doesn't, we don't know at this point in time anyway, whether or not what we're even seeing, it's an integrated whole from lots of different areas of the brain. It just, as far as we can tell, and it just seems, simple's okay, but on such a, I almost would want to say, instead of an argument, it's just an assumption.
Here I find sitting over here defending G.E. Moore. That's fun. I would say regarding the point he doesn't take it seriously, well, he wrote a 20-page paper about it, and, he's a BFD. I'm a Cambridge professor, and I'm famous, and I'm a big fucking deal. And I chose to spend my time writing about it, and I go into great detail in paragraph after paragraph about every last word and every, So I think that he's doing his best to take the problem seriously.
Oh, see, I was thinking it was the other way. Would if he was not a big fucking deal, would he have spent the time on that subject then? Would he have tried to do something a little, from my perspective, more serious or what have you? Go into some detail about something and try and work his way up to becoming a big fucking deal, so that once he is a BFG, he then is like, well, I've made it. Now it's my time to tackle the big problems. Here's two hands.
And then your second point was, is it an argument at all or just an assumption? I think this thing I just read, I would count it as an argument. I would question premise one, that, that seems to be assuming a lot, but that doesn't mean it's not an argument to me.
Yeah, I mean, in its structure and everything, it certainly is an argument in that way, but I would just think that the whole point of the external world, it's just, who's asking for it other than other philosophers, I suppose, as you mentioned. Everyone else just makes an assumption, including probably scientists.
Especially scientists.
There's an external world, and then I'm just going to go fuck with it or whatever. Yeah.
Let me tell you my biggest problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how this isn't a big, fat, question-begging fallacy. If the topic under dispute is itself the existence of external objects, and hands are in the category external objects, if that's what is at question, if you make an argument whose premise begins, this object is a hand, boom, like this is a hand, that to me begs the question against the whatever the opponent is, the idealist, the mereological nihilist, the skeptic.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I thought that I was, you're saying it in your way, and I guess I was saying it in my way when I was like, it's kind of an assumption, though, in a way, like it's already assumed these two external objects are external objects, therefore the external world exists. It's like, and it almost seems like something you just...
So you're kind of saying it's a tautology, or I mean, I guess I could see that as well. Like if the conclusion is external objects exist and premise one is here is two existent external objects.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like we are already assuming that the thing is... That's why it seems to me like, just based on the argument, that he just thought it seems almost tongue-in-cheek to me. That's why I laughed heartily when you were like introducing the argument.
We too agree so far that just when we look at this argument, we're like, what the fuck? Can't do that. And a lot of other people have felt that way and written about this over time. So then, with that established, I'm like, yeah, but remember what your job was, Harland. This guy you do respect, Wittgenstein, respects this paper and this person. So you got to keep pushing past this initial what the fuck phase and try to find what the nugget is, if there is one. Try to be charitable.
Lovers are going to hate. No, wait. Haters are going to hate. But are lovers going to hate? That's the real question here. Well, it's this topic. You're going from G.E. Moore, who you're like, shut the fuck up. And then Wittgenstein's like, that's great. And you're like, what?
Well, yeah, I mean, he doesn't say it's great, but he at least... So, all right, when I try to figure out what's going on here, I think that it's... That version of the argument that I read with the two premises is just missing a premise. Moore does write about it and talk about it, but it doesn't make it into many formulations of the argument. I think it comes down to looking more closely at a general examination at epistemic concepts in general. We got to, what is certainty, knowledge, rigor, proof, doubt, all these things. And I think a lot is contained in that little clause I read at the end.
It is perhaps impossible to give a more rigorous proof of anything, whatever.
If we back off from interpreting Moore as making a dogmatic existential claim when he says, here is a hand, and instead treat him as saying, Moore is more confident of the claim, this is a hand, than he is of any premise that is included in a skeptical argument against the existence of hands. So it doesn't have to be 100%. It just has to be greater than the skeptical arguments. And if he is legitimately, reasonably more confident in the hand premise than skeptical premises, then he thinks that that's enough to justify a defense of the external world. He thinks that at some point we just have to reach these quote-unquote bedrock certainties. And for him, this is one of those. So if we stick into that argument, the premise, it is more likely that this is a hand than that any skeptical arguments are sound, then it's, to me, a little bit more reasonable of an argument. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I got caught up on was that, if he's more confident that this is a hand than it isn't a hand, then he's, I would say, likewise, then more confident in an external world rather than that there is an external world, that's proof of an external world. My opinion, just thinking about it when you said it, I was like, well, that means the whole proof thing also gets us in trouble, I feel like, right? I mean, if you're more confident in something rather than, more certain or whatever, then you kind of, I think the word proof has got a poof, and then maybe it has, it's evidence is the word we want to use. Just simply more confident in an external world. That's where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
Does this help you entirely? Yes, it does. 100% confidence.
100%. Let's get there. I think that Moore does an argument closer to the lines that I'm recommending we switch to in the second paper, in the Defense of Common Sense. Quote!
The method I am going to use for stating, bracket, what I want to state, on bracket, is this. I'm going to begin by enunciating a whole long list of propositions, which may seem at first sight such obvious truisms as not to be worth stating. They are, in fact, a set of propositions, every one of which, in my own opinion, I know with certainty to be true. I begin my list of truisms, every one of which I know with certainty to be true. There exists at present a living human body, which is my body. This body was born at a certain time in the past and has existed continuously ever since, either in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth. Also many other things, having shape and size in 3 dimensions, from which it has been at various distances. Some other things in contact. Large numbers of living human bodies, each of which at some time have been born and continue to exist not far from the earth. Many of these other bodies have also died, and the earth has existed for many years before I was born. I have, I think, no better argument than simply this, namely, that all the propositions just read are, in fact, true.
He just fucking does it. Like that, it's a very commonsensical defense of common sense. He just says a bunch of things that he finds likely and thinks that the rest of us will also find likely. Then he literally just calls them true. I think that's interesting. It's just so interesting that this is a acceptable way to argue, because to me it's so unacceptable.
Who is this guy, G.E. Moore? What was his mental state? Honestly, it's just, what did he do before these papers? What's his work like prior to this? Because he doesn't seem to me to be saying anything that anybody who's thoughtful couldn't kind of say as well, but even if they aren't a philosopher or whatever. What is it that he brings to the table with these papers on external world and common sense that other people in his time couldn't also have just said? What's he doing?
Maybe it's, somebody had to say it. Like, if these arguments are going to be made, at some point, someone had to codify what other people consider to be the best version of these arguments, and say, it's obvious, but somebody had to say it, somebody had to write it down, and he's the one that happened to bubble up above the surface and get into the anthologies. So he's the one that's doing it.
He was the one with a platform.
This is the kind of stuff that if you're doing Philosophy 101 with the freshmen or the whatever, a bunch of them are going to have these attitudes and sympathize with these attitudes and be excited that a wig-wearing old white man, like a special privileged, whatever, like this guy, there's a big famous smart guy who said these things. So I think that's part of it. We just need someone to play this role and to make these arguments that many people are going to want to make as chimps. The way that the argument in Defense of Common Sense is written in the Just the Arguments book, mentioned moments ago, is as follows. And I think this one is slightly more interesting. I have tons of problems with it as well, but...
Premise 1.
The skeptic's assumptions imply that propositions such as, I know that this is a pencil, are false.
Premise 2.
If proposition A is more certain than proposition B, then B cannot falsify A. In other words, if we're more confident of A than B, then we can't use B to throw out A. That is a huge thing, and that's what Moore is doing in here, I think. I agree.
Premise 3.
I know this is a pencil is more certain than any skeptical premise.
Conclusion.
The skeptic is wrong. The skeptic's assumptions cannot falsify. I know this is a pencil. I think that's an interesting argument form, and there's much that can be said about it that we're not going to say. But that's